Okay, let's dive in. I mean, take a look around. Politics feels wild. Polarization is, well, it's off the charts. And everyone's talking about this bewildering post-truth world. It kind of feels like we've lost our collective compass.
It absolutely does feel like a fundamental shift, yeah. And, there are certainly many obvious factors people point to. The decline of, say, traditional beliefs, the pervasive influence of social media,
Definitely social media.
right, with its echo chambers and anonymity, and
Yeah.
just this general sense of cultural breakdown. Our sources touch on all of that, noting how social media seems to almost select for nasty, irrational interactions and studies linking it to rising anxiety and depression.
Right. You hear people describe this era as the age of unreason. And while those external forces are clearly playing a role, the sources we're exploring today, primarily excerpts from Ken Wilber's book, A Post-Truth World, and related material, they argue there's a much deeper, less recognized factor driving all this chaos.
And that factor, according to these specific sources, is the surprising and, well, really significant role of human developmental stages. So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the core insights from this material, understanding why these particular challenges are surfacing now through the lens of human growth and what that perspective might offer for moving forward.
Developmental stages. You mean, like, how humans grow up? It seems a bit counterintuitive to link that to political chaos and, the collapse of truth.
It does at first glance, yeah. But the sources suggest it's actually central. One of the key discoveries in modern psychology over the last century or so is that humans naturally move through a series of major developmental stages. Think of them as shifts in consciousness or perspective. The sources use terms like archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral, sort of like building blocks in how we make sense of the world.
And the idea, as presented in the sources, is that these stages don't just, like, replace the old ones, they transcend and include them, like layers maybe, or building blocks.
Exactly. That's the key concept, transcend and include. Like a molecule transcends and includes atoms. A cell transcends and includes molecules. These stages build upon each other. And the sources argue that a major reason for the current instability is that as Western culture has been transitioning, particularly from the rational stage towards the pluralistic one, something went unexpectedly, perhaps even catastrophically, wrong.
Okay, so let's follow that evolutionary pathway then, drawing from the sources to see how these stages might help us understand today's conflicts.
Yeah, let's do that. We can start with the earliest stages relevant to this discussion. There's the egocentric, or what the sources often call the red stage. This is the initial sort of tribal magic thinking phase. Crucially, individuals at this stage struggle deeply with taking the perspective of others. They essentially cannot take your point of view, driven primarily by immediate selfish needs and drives. And while it's the earliest stage, this egocentric orientation can absolutely persist or reappear in adults.
Okay, so focus purely on self. What comes next in the sequence?
Following that is the ethnocentric, or amber stage. This is marked by the emergence of mythic thinking and, critically, identity centered on the group, family, tribe, nation, religion. This is really the foundation for strong us versus them dynamics, even the potential for, well, holy war. It's associated with traditional values, fundamentalist beliefs, and often patriarchal or nationalistic structures.
Right.
And the sources cite research suggesting a significant portion, maybe around 60% of the population in places like the U.S., still primarily identify at this level, or even lower stages. Historically, global slavery peaked during eras dominated by this kind of ethnocentric identity.
60% primarily at amber or lower. Wow. That's a really striking statistic. You definitely see that strong group identity playing out today. But the sources mentioned this stage isn't only negative, is that right?
That's a really important point, yes. From this amber stage, there is genuine, deep love and fierce loyalty to one's group, family, or nation. So while it has its downsides like exclusivity and potential for conflict, it also enabled the formation of larger social structures bound by shared myths, laws, and beliefs, moving beyond purely tribal affiliations. It was a necessary step.
Got it. So red is egocentric, then amber is ethnocentric, focused on group identity. Where does development go from there, according to the sources?
The next major leap is the world-centric, or orange stage. This represents a pretty significant shift to a third-person perspective. Individuals can now think more objectively, globally, and prioritize universal principles. This stage is tightly linked to the rise of modern science, the nation-state, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution. Identity expands here to encompass all humans, which the sources highlight, is why the first widespread global anti-slavery movements emerged about 200 years ago. It's seen as a direct consequence of this growing world-centric awareness. Orange embodies modern values like science, progress, individual rights, meritocracy, and a focus on achievement and, yes, profit.
That sounds like a huge step towards universalism and progress. I mean, ending slavery globally for the first time. But the sources mention limitations here too, like downsides.
Yes, like every stage, it had its shadow side, absolutely. Orange, in its drive for objectivity, often reduced reality solely to the material and external what you can measure. This led to what Max Weber called a disenchantment of the world, a disconnect from subjective experiences, values, meaning what the sources sometimes refer to as losing touch with the good and the beautiful. It also created powerful systems that, while founded on world-centric ideals, could still be exploited by lower, more self-serving perspectives.
Okay, so orange is world-centric, but with this strong focus on science, objectivity, the individual. And then comes the next world-centric stage, green. Is that right?
Precisely. The green stage develops what's called a fourth-person perspective, allowing individuals to step back and critique the modern orange systems themselves. This stage was the driving force behind the major cultural revolutions of the 1960s. The civil rights movement, global environmentalism, feminism, anti-colonialism. Its core focus was on inclusivity, diversity, context, and equality. For decades, green really represented the leading edge of cultural evolution in the West.
And the sources are clear that this green stage started with really healthy and very appropriate movements, like civil rights, as you said. But then it took a turn. It went wrong somewhere.
This is exactly where the sources locate a critical point of breakdown, and it's central to understanding the post-truth world. Over time, certain aspects of the green or postmodern stage began to sort of calcify and twist into dysfunctional, even extreme forms.
How did that actually manifest? What did it look like?
Well, it's healthy pluralism. The vital appreciation of multiple valid perspectives rigidified into a kind of rampant relativism. And the valuable understanding that all knowledge is contextualized morphed into the radical and ultimately self-defeating idea that all truth is just shifting contexts.
So it wasn't just acknowledging different ways of seeing things, different viewpoints, but arguing there's no underlying shared reality or truth at all.
Exactly. The sources identify this as the central disastrous move of unhealthy green, declaring there is no truth. Knowledge became viewed not as reflecting reality, however imperfectly, but purely as a social construct, usually a tool of power or oppression. From this extreme perspective, science became no more true than, say, a poem or just a personal feeling, fact and fiction blurred.
Wow, that sounds incredibly destabilizing. I mean, what are the consequences of believing there is no truth?
The sources argue this inevitably leads to a collapse into nihilism, the conviction that there are no objective truths, no inherent values, no discoverable meaning. And this nihilism is often coupled, ironically, with narcissism. Because if there's no external standard of truth, then perhaps the only truth left is simply what I want to be true or what feels true to me. The sources use the term aperspectival madness to describe this state.
The perspectival madness.
Yeah, it's the inability or refusal to see from any kind of objective or even shared perspective, leading to profound internal contradictions and a loss of connection to shared reality.
And this aperspectival madness, as they call it, basically crippled the leading edge of culture.
Fundamentally, yes. If the cutting edge of culture becomes saturated with nihilism and narcissism, it loses its direction. If no direction is true, how can you possibly choose a path forward? The evolutionary process stalls. The sources state that the green leading edge, instead of creating order out of chaos, which is what healthy stages tend to do, found itself producing more chaos out of chaos.
And this belief system, this there is no truth idea, which originated in these extreme forms of green thinking, then sort of seeped into the wider culture, creating the conditions for the post-truth world we're seeing now. The sources give some really powerful examples of this in action, don't they?
They do. They point to figures, for instance, in the Brexit campaign, who reportedly admitted pushing narratives they knew weren't factually accurate, because in their view, the very idea of objective facts was kind of passé, outdated.
Right. And the sources draw a direct line from that kind of thinking to Donald Trump's approach.
Yes, absolutely. Trump's communication style is presented as a stark manifestation of this post-truth environment. The sources discuss his willingness to openly state things that were demonstrably false, his team coining phrases like alternative facts. And yet, despite factual inaccuracies being widely documented, polls show that many people felt Trump was actually more truthful than other politicians.
Which, again, feels completely backwards from a traditional perspective focusing on facts. How could someone factually inaccurate be seen as more truthful?
It's a paradox, isn't it? But the argument is that in a culture where objective truth has been devalued by the leading edge itself, factual accuracy loses its traditional power. The sources argue that Trump's fervent, even narcissistic declaration of his truth, his passionate assertions, resonated more deeply with many of the measured, factual statements. His conviction felt more authentic in an atmosphere where the very idea of shared objective reality had dissolved.
And social media seems just perfectly designed to amplify this, doesn't it? The sources mention the selfie culture.
Absolutely. Social media makes it almost effortless to curate, filter, and even Photoshop individual realities, creating what the sources call pleasant lies or reassuring falsehoods. These thrive in online echo chambers where dissenting facts are simply excluded or shouted down. The sources connect this digital ease of altering reality back to earlier cultural shifts, like the focus in some educational circles on self-esteem without necessarily linking it to actual accomplishment, fostering a kind of fragile narcissism that finds a perfect home in this post-truth digital landscape.
The sources cite a really disturbing example from a Guardian article by Carol Cadwalader using Google searches. Can you remind us of that?
Yes, this example is quite revealing and quite chilling. Cadwalader searched simple, fundamental questions like, are women evil? Are Muslims bad? Even was Hitler bad? And Google search results, driven by its algorithms at the time, returned deeply hateful, extremist answers. Top results for was Hitler bad included white supremacist sites arguing things like 10 reasons why Hitler was one of the good guys.
That's just horrific. How could a search engine supposedly designed to organize information prioritize such hateful views? What went wrong there?
Well, the sources explain that Google's algorithms, certainly back then, were primarily designed to organize information and make it useful and accessible. But useful often translated to popular, clickable, or content that generated strong engagement, not necessarily truthful or ethically sound content. In a culture infected with this eperspectival madness, where hateful views are often intensely felt and passionately shared online, the algorithms gave these views legitimacy and visibility based on usage metrics, not on their validity or truthfulness. The system simply wasn't built at its core to filter for truth or ethical value.
And the sources connect this failure directly to tragic real-world outcomes.
They do, citing the case of Dylan Roof. His online manifesto detailed how searching for things like black-on-white crime led him down a rabbit hole of white supremacist hate sites filled with distorted facts. Misinformation, the sources say, was absolutely foundational to his radicalization and the subsequent horrific hate crime he committed. As the Southern Poverty Law Center noted, in this kind of environment, the truth got submerged.
So, in this post-truth culture, information gets organized by popularity or passion, not accuracy, with genuinely dangerous consequences.
Precisely. And the sources also tie this post-truth environment to what they describe as a legitimation crisis. This is a growing gap between the cultural narrative, which has been heavily shaped by green values, emphasizing equality and personal empowerment for all, and the actual techno-economic reality many people face.
And that reality being, what's the mismatch?
Well, increasing inequality, stagnant wages for large segments of the population, job displacement due to automation and AI. The culture tells people they are empowered and equal, that they should expect opportunity, but their lived reality, often marked by economic precarity or feeling left behind, doesn't match that promise. This mismatch causes suffering, and that suffering brews what the sources call resentiment.
Resentiment, like resentment.
It's a specific kind of resentment, yeah. A deep, bitter, often mean-spirited resentment toward the perceived causes of their suffering, often directed at elites or groups seen as benefiting from the system.
Okay, so you have this cultural collapse of truth within the green stage, combined with this growing resentment fueled by the legitimation crisis. The sources argue this created the perfect conditions that someone like Donald Trump intuitively or deliberately tapped into.
Yes, exactly. The sources present Trump's rise and subsequent election as a manifestation of a kind of evolutionary self-correction. Seeing the leading edge green flounder in dysfunction and nihilism, the evolutionary process itself generated a powerful anti-green atmosphere, a reaction against green's perceived excesses and failures.
And Trump basically rode that wave.
The sources argue he did, very effectively. More than any specific policy, Trump's defining characteristic, according to this analysis, was being fundamentally anti-green. His rhetoric and actions were often a direct repudiation of things associated with green: political correctness, environmental regulations, globalism, multiculturalism.
How did this anti-green stance activate those earlier stages you mentioned, like amber?
Well, by being so clearly anti-green, He provided a powerful rallying point that energized people operating from all pre-green stages. While the amber, ethnocentric level was certainly central, his Make America Great Again slogan, the focus on national borders, the anti-immigration stances directly appealed to that group identity. His general anti-green posture resonated more widely. Dismantling environmental regulations appealed to some orange levels focused on industry and profit. The anti-PC rhetoric appealed broadly to many who felt frustrated or looked down upon by perceived green cultural dominance.
And resentment was the engine driving a lot of this.
Crucially, yes. The deep-seated resentment felt by many towards the cultural elite, often perceived as embodying green values, was immense. Fueled by the economic legitimation crisis and the feeling of being ignored or actively disdained, famously summed up in Hillary Clinton's comment about a basket of deplorables, this anger was incredibly potent. The sources noted statistics showing that 81% of voters who described themselves as angry in exit polls voted for Trump. That anger was laser-focused on the perceived green establishment.
And this whole developmental perspective helps explain why the election results were so surprising to so many people.
Exactly. The sources suggest that many analysts and pollsters, often operating primarily from within green or perhaps orange perspectives themselves, completely missed these powerful underlying developmental currents and the potent force of the anti-green reaction. They weren't seeing the whole picture, which led to widespread shock and disbelief when the results came in.
Okay, let's shift slightly then and look at one of Green's core and certainly commendable goals, ending oppression. The sources acknowledge this is a high and worthy ideal.
It absolutely is. The aspiration to create a more just and equitable world, free from oppression based on race, gender, orientation, and so on, is deeply valuable and a hallmark of higher development.
But the sources critique Green's understanding of where oppression comes from, or maybe how to solve it.
Fundamentally, yes. Green often views the lack of its desired values, like equality and inclusivity, as being solely due to the active presence of oppression, caused by structures or individuals embodying isms like racism, sexism, or patriarchy. The typical green solution then focuses on identifying, calling out, and stopping these external behaviors, essentially trying to criminalize or cancel oppressive actions or speech. Focus on the externals.
And the developmental perspective offers a different view.
Yes. The sources argue that the lack of green values in individuals or groups is often not due to active repression by those at lower stages, but simply the absence of the necessary higher developmental capacity. People operating primarily from earlier stages, like amber, ethnocentric, don't necessarily repress world-centric green values. They simply haven't developed the internal structure, the cognitive and emotional capacity to genuinely understand or embody them yet. Those values are, in a very real sense, over their heads.
This brings us to a really critical distinction the sources make about hierarchies, doesn't it?
This is absolutely essential to the whole argument. The sources differentiate forcefully between dominator hierarchies, which are unhealthy, oppressive, and based on power over dynamics, think slavery, rigid caste systems, dictatorships, and growth hierarchies, which are seen as healthy, natural, actualizing, and fundamentally inclusive.
Growth hierarchies? Like what?
Like the stages of human development itself or the natural organizational complexity we see in the universe. Atoms are included in molecules, which are included in cells, which are included in organisms. In healthy growth hierarchies, each higher level transcends but includes the lower, and is generally more complex, more capable, and more inclusive in its scope. Development itself is a growth hierarchy.
And Green's major misstep, according to these sources.
The sources argue Green made a catastrophic error. It confused and rejected all hierarchies, including these healthy natural growth hierarchies. They threw the baby out with the bathwater. This is seen as catastrophic because it denies the very process of development, the growth hierarchy that moves people away from wanting to dominate others in the first place. The sources argue that only the lowest stages are primarily driven by power over impulses. By rejecting the concept of growth hierarchies, Green effectively dismantled the ladder of development that offers the most profound and lasting cure for oppression.
Wow. Okay. The sources also mention something called a performative contradiction in Green's position. What's that about?
Yes. This refers to the way Green often claims that all truths, values, and perspectives are equally valid, that no judgments or rankings are possible or legitimate. What's true for you is true for you, don't judge. Yet, in the very same breath, it passionately judges and condemns views it deems harmful, like racism or sexism, which from a higher, more developed perspective are indeed harmful and less adequate views. But this judgment fundamentally contradicts Green's own stated premise of no ranking, no hierarchy of values.
So it's inconsistent.
Exactly. This internal contradiction leaves extreme Green unable to logically defend its own position or find a coherent path forward. It can't legitimate its own values based on its own premises.
And for social justice efforts, the consequence of this confusion and focusing only on the surface is...
Exactly. The sources argue that focusing exclusively on policing external behavior and trying to force behavioral equality without addressing the underlying internal developmental landscape, well, it often just breeds deeper resentment, that resentment we talked about. People may outwardly comply to avoid social sanction, but secretly hold on to exclusionary beliefs because their fundamental worldview hasn't actually shifted or grown. And trying to give an equal voice to genuinely hateful or rigidly ethnocentric views under the banner of radical diversity simply because Green rejects all ranking becomes dangerous and ultimately self-defeating.
So if the dysfunction of the Green leading edge is so central to the problem, how do the sources see a way forward emerging? What are the possibilities?
Well, the sources discuss the potential for evolution's own self-correction mechanisms to eventually find a new, functional leading edge. They outline two main possibilities, or maybe parallel tracks. Option one is what they call Green self-healing.
Okay, how would Green heal itself? What would that look like?
This would require two pretty significant internal shifts within the Green stage itself. First, dropping its pervasive hostility and resentment towards earlier stages like Amber and Orange. Really starting to see individuals operating from those stages with more compassion and understanding, rather than simply dismissing them as deplorables or inherently oppressive. The sources reference essays that point out the role of, frankly, liberal classism and contempt towards working-class populations, asking the challenging question of who is supposedly more evolved and therefore perhaps more responsible for taking the first step in bridging these deep divides.
That's a challenging point. And the second step for Green healing?
The second crucial step is accepting and understanding the reality and importance of growth hierarchies. Recognizing that these natural developmental processes are the very foundation upon which values like inclusivity and world-centric awareness emerge. Green needs to learn to distinguish healthy rankings of competence, of moral development, of perspective-taking ability from unhealthy dominator hierarchies, realizing that judging some views as less adequate or harmful is actually necessary for progress, not a betrayal of pluralism.
The sources mention boomeritis as an example of where this Green dysfunction is often visible. Can you explain that?
Yes, it's a term Wilber uses, describing it as green pluralism, getting infected with earlier red egocentric narcissism. It's often seen, for example, in educational philosophies that heavily emphasize self-esteem, divorced from requiring objective competence or accomplishment. It confuses lower-stage egocentrism, I'm special just because I'm me, with genuine higher-stage autonomy and self-worth earned through growth. It's a classic example of what developmentalists call a pre-post fallacy, where you confuse a lower pre-rational stage with a higher post-rational one because they might superficially look similar, like rejecting convention, for instance.
Are there signs that this Green self-healing might actually be happening? Any hopeful indicators?
The sources point to one major hopeful sign, actually, emerging right after the 2016 election. Trump's extremely blatant, no truth, alternative facts approach seemed to make the very idea of denying objective truth uncomfortable, even embarrassing, for many who might have previously been steeped in postmodern relativism. There was an almost immediate cultural recoil, a renewed defense of the idea of truth in mainstream media and parts of academia. The sources note campaigns like the New York Times running ads stating truth is now more important than ever, suggesting that the shaky foundation of no truth within some extreme Green viewpoints might actually be crumbling under pressure.
Okay, so Green self-healing is one possibility, or part of the path forward. What's the second option the sources discuss for a new leading edge?
Option two is the continued emergence and eventual influence of the integral stage, or what the sources sometimes call second-tier consciousness. While currently representing a relatively small percentage of the population, this stage is described as fundamentally different because it inherently sees, appreciates, and integrates the value and limitations of all the previous stages.
How does it achieve that integration? What makes it different?
Well, the sources often mention the integral framework, sometimes summarized by the acronym AQUAL, which stands for all quadrants, addressing subjective, objective, intersubjective and interobjective realities, basically, interior and exterior, individual and collective perspectives. All levels, including all the developmental stages we've discussed. All lines, recognizing the development occurs along multiple different pathways or intelligences, cognitive, emotional, moral, spiritual, etc. All states, incorporating different states of consciousness like waking, dreaming, deep sleep, meditative or peak experiences, and all types, other valid classifications like masculine, feminine, etc. Integral consciousness, by its very nature, sees the partial truths in each stage and provides a framework for genuine inclusion that transcends the pitfalls and contradictions of dysfunctional green.
And the sources suggest this emergence could be profoundly transformative if it reaches a certain point.
Yes, they point out that while integral stages might currently represent maybe 5% of the adult population, historical models suggest that reaching a tipping point of around 10% could trigger a significant cultural transformation. A shift to a more complex, integrated, and functional way of organizing society, unlike anything previously seen in history. The ultimate vision discussed in some of the material is creating a deliberately developmental culture, one that actively understands and fosters growth through these stages for everyone.
So looking ahead, putting it all together, what future does the source material suggest is the most likely scenario? Is it one or the other, green healing or integral emerging?
The most probable scenario, according to the sources, is likely a combination of both happening concurrently. Some degree of green healing seems necessary for it to regain any functional capacity as a major cultural force, particularly by dropping its reflexive hostility to other stages and moving away from the absolute no-truth stance. That seems to be starting. However, the full integration and understanding of healthy growth hierarchies and the creation of a truly inclusive framework that honors both unity and diversity might require a more widespread emergence into the integral stage itself.
Okay, so to bring it all together then, this deep dive really reveals that understanding the chaos, the polarization, the whole post-truth world isn't just about specific political events or surface-level disagreements, is it?
That's really the core insight, yeah. It's deeply rooted in these hidden currents of human development. The current instability is, in large part, an evolutionary self-correction, a reaction spurred by the previous cultural leading edge, the green stage collapsing into the dysfunction of aperspectival madness, the inability to agree on or even believe in shared reality or objective values.
And the sources argue that events like Trump's election, while incredibly shocking to many, can be seen through this lens as both a symptom and maybe even a kind of harsh wake-up call, a manifestation of that evolutionary drive attempting to react against the failures and limitations of the previous leading edge.
Precisely. The shock itself highlights how few people were seeing this underlying developmental story unfolding.
But understanding this bigger picture, using this lens of human development, offers more than just analysis, right? It offers a pathway, maybe.
It offers a different kind of hope, I think. It moves us beyond simply feeling despair or feeling trapped by external events. It suggests that this difficult period, this turbulence, is part of a larger process of potential growth and healing, both on a cultural scale and, importantly, within each of us individually.
Because these developmental stages aren't just abstract theory about groups or cultures, are they? They're personal.
Not at all. They operate within you, within me, right now. Understanding these stages provides an incredibly powerful tool for self-reflection, for understanding our own reactions, our own deeply held beliefs and values, and for navigating the complexity of the world around us with maybe a bit more perspective. This kind of deep dive is, in a very real sense, also a process of self-discovery.
And the sources leave us with a final thought that kind of connects this personal and collective journey, offering one last perspective on how to approach all these challenges.
Yeah, they suggest that when faced with the suffering and difficulties of the world, we essentially have a choice. We can dedicate ourselves endlessly to trying to fix the dream, which means addressing only the external symptoms and appearances of the world as it presents itself to us. Or we can also cultivate the capacity to wake up, which generally refers to the exploration of higher states and stages of consciousness, looking inward. The sources conclude with what they call the true and ultimate secret, that the integral embrace, because it includes and integrates all levels and dimensions of reality, inner and outer, individual and collective, states and stages, actually achieves both. It leads simultaneously to inner liberation and a more skillful, compassionate, and fulfilled engagement with the world. It frees us and fulfills us at the same time.